Good afternoon, everybody, and hope that your lunch break was good and we feel well rested and well nourished, and on we go. Professor of Poetry, 1951. We were all wrong. It was Cecil Day Lewis. Ah, yes, of course, we all say. So there was that. I could not find the poem that Colin really wanted to share with us between C.S. Lewis and Arthur Greaves, but Colin did. And I'm now going to try and read it for us. Also, welcome, of course, to those watching at home. Hope your lunch went well too. Here is the poem. That we may mark with wonder and chaste dread at hour of noon, when with our limbs outspread lazily in the whispering grass, we lie to gaze out fully upon the windy sky, far, far away, and kindly, friend with friend, to talk the old talk that has no end, roaming without a name, without a chart, the unknown garden of another's heart. That is pretty good, isn't it? I'd never heard that before.
No, I just found it by accident once, and, or it might have been in the front of the book.
So Colin found it by accident, might have been at the front of the book. For me, that sort of moves Lewis slightly from minor to major poet, would we feel? What is the title, says Heather?
I added the title myself. So, what does it give the title?
Is that Fulcandra, but that would be another thing.
No, that's a planet.
We're not sure if it's titled.
I know what the title I gave it, sorry, was The Old Talk.
Yes.
The Old Talk. This would be when his first friendship with Arthur Greaves was probably when Lewis was quite young, but I don't know which year it was. It was just out of context. So.
One of the lovely things about Oxford Centre for Spiritual Growth is you say one thing and the questions come flying, because we love to learn more. I do like that line, to talk the old talk that has no end. Oh, great. Anyway, that was in fact this last session's talk, so we're not going for that. Thank you, Colin, so much for finding that. One or two have asked about the streaming of this. All being well, it is going to end up on YouTube, and Ben will be spreading the word about the link to it. So that's the plan for that. Also, one or two have been asking about Oxford Centre for Spiritual Growth. And could I suggest, if you want to know more, then do ask Ben at some point this afternoon, because he is the fount of all wisdom. And it's right that we continue to give thanks for Georgie, who began all this several years ago, and members of the family here today. Anyway, without further ado, over to Colin for the C.S. Lewis, the Imaginative Man.
I changed my glasses because I was a bit of a problem earlier. That means I can see the script very clearly, but I can't see you so well. But I will change the glasses soon so I can see you again. Now, this, in a way, this follows on a bit from the last talk, The Imaginative Man. It was a talk I gave a couple of years ago, and I thought it might fit really well. I did make some changes, though. The Imaginative Man. C.S. Lewis wrote in 1954 of the, quote, imaginative man as being more fundamental in him than, quote, either the religious writer or the critic, unquote. According to his friend Owen Barfield, imagination was the integrating factor in Lewis's thought and writings. Lewis's developed views of imagination, myth, and incarnation were part of his quest to grasp the real and to achieve a surrender of the self to the other. This quest explains the course of his imaginative writing, from his early allegory, The Pilgrim's Regress, through his science fiction, his theological fiction such as the Screwtape Letters and the Narnian Chronicles, to his retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche in his novel Till We Have Faces. It also explains the deliberate change in strategy in the 1950s when he moved in emphasis from abstract or heavily reasoned Christian apologetics, such as The Problem of Pain and Miracles, to a more concrete and poetic style of communication that he had developed in his imaginative writings. In the 1950s, when post-war austerity was slowly passing, as well as the drudgery of caring for the elderly Mrs. Janie Moore, essentially Lewis's adoptive mother, Lewis was facing a great dilemma. It was not success he was after. He had plenty of that. The publication in particular of the Screwtape Letters and his popular BBC broadcast talks during the war had placed him among the highest profile Christian communicators of his time in Britain, along with the likes of his friend Dorothy L. Sayers. His fame was steadily spreading to the USA. A reporter from Time magazine had been in Oxford in 1944 researching, interviewing, among others, his friend Charles Williams. Lewis had long ago, like his friend Tolkien, abandoned his yearning to be a major poet. But he was very conscious of the effectiveness of his books in helping to communicate Christian faith to modern readers. The BBC talks and his visits to RAF stations in wartime had helped him also to measure what he could do as a popular speaker rather than a well-polished academic lecturer. But an experiment that was much closer to his heart than the broadcast, allowing him to engage more directly with both his opponents and his supporters, was the Oxford Socratic Club, one of the most successful Oxford societies for students, which had begun in the war years and which he continued to serve with verve when the war was over. Chaired by its founder, Stella Aldwinkle, the club discussed questions about Christian faith raised by atheists, agnostics, and those disillusioned with religion. Lewis served as president at Aldwinkle's request for many years. During the Socratic Club meetings, Lewis's wit was always ready to fire. On one occasion, when as usual he was in the chair, someone taken with the new analytical philosophy raised the question during discussion time. And the question was, how can you prove anything? I mean, how can you prove there is not a blue cow sitting on that piano? Lewis responded, in what sense blue? Perfect. I love that. One winter's evening in 1948, a philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe, who had studied in Cambridge under Ludwig Wittgenstein, presenting a paper responding to a central argument Lewis had used in chapter 3 of his book Miracles, that a naturalist or materialist position was self-refuting. Her critique is often interpreted as representing a defeat which led Lewis into serious doubt about his whole approach to the intellectual defense of Christian faith, after which he had turned to children's stories about Narnia. Anscombe's paper, however, merely aimed to clarify and to throw light on some confusion in Lewis's chapter. Lewis did acknowledge afterwards that he had been unclear. In fact, neither he nor Anscombe regarded the argument as anything less than essentially robust, despite the shortcomings in its expression to which Anscombe had called attention. In response to the debate, Lewis rewrote the chapter, clarifying it for a later edition, which appeared a dozen years later in 1960. Rather than undermining his confidence, what this encounter did was to bring Lewis to acknowledge that philosophy in England at the time had become increasingly specialized and analytical. He did not object to such analysis, but he felt that if he continued in that more and more rarefied world, he would only be communicating with a smaller and smaller audience. Increasingly, he believed that his calling was to a wider readership, the kind that had responded so well to his popular theological fiction, such as the Screwtape Letters. After this realization, he took a much more indirect approach to conveying Christianity in a number of books. This use of allusion could be found in further works of popular theology that Lewis wrote, such as The Four Loves, 1960, Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer, 1964. It also characterizes his much-read A Grief Observed, 1961. These emphasize the spiritual dimension of human experience, even the painful journey through the bitterness of loss. His memoir of his early life, Surprised by Joy, is written to share and portray the human longing he calls joy, which led him back to a belief in God. These later books, published in the period between 1940 and 1952, therefore have a somewhat different character than the more discursive approach of his earlier The Problem of Pain, Miracles, The Abolition of Man, and even his popular wartime broadcast talks, which were brought together in his book, Mere Christianity. Before his shift of emphasis at around the end of the 1940s, Lewis expected his books to fall into a quiet obscurity. He explained this at the time to a Dr. Warfield M. Firor, a generous American who supplied him with food parcels during the post-war years of continued austerity. Quote, this is Lewis, I am going to be, if I live long enough, one of those men who was a famous writer in his 40s and dies unknown, like Christian going down into the green valley of humiliation, end quote. Lewis's impression of sales at this time were in fact wrong. This quiet humbling was soon no longer required. With fast-growing interest in his writings in the USA and the success of his annually appearing Narnia stories for children, he gradually realized that he had an important opportunity to seize in imaginative writing. Lewis was not responding to a sudden impulse when he thus considered a change of emphasis in his writing. That it represented a carefully considered decision can be seen, for instance, in two letters he wrote in 1954 and 1955, both to Americans. In one, he explained to the Milton Society of America why he was turning down their request to speak. He began by pointing out that though a list of his books might look a, quote, mixed bag, unquote, they did have a, quote, guiding thread, and that in his makeup, what he recalled the imaginative man was the most basic part of him. He wrote, I think I've already read some of this, but I'm going to read it again, this quote from Lewis. The imaginative man in me is older, more continuously operative, and in that sense, more basic than either the religious writer or the critic. It is he who, in response to the poetry of others, made me a critic, and in defense of that response, sometimes a critical controversialist. It was he who, after my conversion, led me to embody my religious beliefs in symbolical or mythopoeic forms, ranging from Screwtape to a kind of theologized science fiction. And it was, of course, he who has brought me in the last few years to write the series of Narnia stories for children, not asking what children want and then endeavoring to adapt myself. This was not needed. But because the fairy tale was the genre that fitted what I wanted to say. In a more explicit letter, Lewis expressed his sense of a new direction in his calling, or rather a direction that he acknowledged already existing in his writings, but which he wished to emphasize more. A leading American theologian, Carl F.H. Henry, wrote to Lewis in 1955, asking him to contribute to a new monthly magazine he was setting up as editor called Christianity Today, and aiming at thoughtful theological comment on society and culture, with a strong literary quality. Lewis replied to Carl Henry in a very open way. And here's Lewis's words. My thought and talent, such as they are, now flow in different, though I think not less Christian, channels, and I do not think I am at all likely to write more directly theological pieces. If I am now good for anything, it is for catching the reader unawares, through fiction and symbol. I have done what I could in a way of frontal attacks, but now feel quite sure those days are over. Oh, now my words again. I think an important seed for this shift by Lewis had been planted nearly 9 years before the letter to Dr. Henry, when he and his brother Warren, the year after the war, had travelled to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. At St. Andrews, on 28th of June 1946, Lewis was made a Doctor of Divinity, a rare honour for a layman. At the degrees ceremony, the words of Professor D.M. Bailey, Dean of the Faculty of Divinity, were truly remarkable. And this is what Professor Bailey said, or some of what he said. With his pen and with his voice on the radio, Mr. Lewis has succeeded in capturing the attention of many who will not readily listen to professional theologians, and has taught them many lessons concerning the deep things of God. In recent years, Mr. Lewis has arranged a new kind of marriage between theological reflection and poetic imagination, and this fruitful union is now producing works which are difficult to classify in any literary genre. It can only be said in respectful admiration that he pursues, quote, things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. Now that came from, I can't remember where that came from, that quote. Anyway, that's what it was said. I love it. These perceptive words may have helped Lewis to clarify thoughts he was already beginning to harbour about future ventures. An American, Chad Walsh, whom Lewis had made a confidant, shows that he was aware of Lewis's intention to shift the focus in his writings. I should say that Chad Walsh had come over from the US to meet Lewis and to talk to him. And he was a very perceptive writer, actually. Words written by Walsh in 1949 point towards the future. This is some of what Walsh wrote. Patently, Lewis has not written himself out, but the books he has in mind suggest he is taking a holiday from the kind of writing that has created his public reputation. His admirers busily urge various theological topics upon him, but so far as I know, he has no immediate plans for further works of apologetics. In my words, it could be said that Lewis was moving from conventional to imaginative apologetics, sneaking past what he called, quote, the watchful dragons, unquote. He was increasingly aware of how much the, quote, imaginative man, unquote, had been a guiding thread in his work. Just something about the domestic front in Lewis's house, the Kilns. On the domestic front, in later years of the 1940s, were difficult for Lewis, as life in his home, the Kilns, on the fringe of Oxford at that time, became more and more fraught. It became problematic, if not impossible, to detain domestic helps under Mrs. Janie Moore's decline into increasingly autocratic rule, as Lewis's brother Warren called it. For one day to the next, Lewis wrote, he did not know when he could pull back from his duties, quote, as a nurse and a domestic servant, close quote, full stop. An additional burden was his brother's increasing bouts of drinking, a symptom of his creeping alcoholism, a condition that distressed Lewis considerably. A further complication was the aging and increasingly decrepit family dog. Bruce, the name of the dog, to which Mrs. Dore clung progressively. It was a relief to his brothers when he died in his dotage. That was the dog. In his diary, Warren recalled some of the dog's worst traits. One was that Bruce would sometimes bark incessantly all night. And then, while he dozed during the day, Mrs. Moore would order the boys, that's what she called Lewis and his brother, to make no noise in case they woke him. Can't you believe it? Released from his obligations to his adopted mother with her death in early January 1951, preceded by the respite of her 9-month period in a nearby care home, made important changes for Lewis more easily. His shift of direction towards more indirect and elusive communication of Christian theology was nowhere more obvious than in his completing 2 volumes of the Chronicles of Narnia by the end of 1949. The first 2 chapters, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, had been drafted by March that year. This was just 2 years after the publication in 1947 of one of the best of his overtly theological books, Miracles, especially if you like philosophy. I love that book, actually. I'm not a philosopher. Lewis continued to create his Narnian stories during the 1950s. The prestigious Carnegie Medal was awarded to Lewis in 1956 of the occasion of the publication of The Last Battle in recognition of the whole series. Lewis's turn to more imaginative writing, even if subtle, was paying off. The books were being received by a very wide readership. Lewis's postbag was getting larger and larger as child readers wrote to him, along with numerous adult readers of other books, such as the Screwtape Letters. Lewis in the Narnian stories demonstrates the distinctive and real nature of God in the magical figure of Aslan, which is Turkish for lion, who is elusive yet definite, wild, surprising, and who always shapes events in his own good way, even when all seems dark and lost. Lewis perfectly balances Aslan's wildness and sometimes terrifying nature with his approachability, beauty, and gentleness. In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Lucy and Susan do something that they never would have dared to do without his permission. To comfort him, they sink their cold hands into the sea of his beautiful mane. He dances with them when he returns to life. And afterwards, Lucy can't make up her mind whether it was like playing with a thunderstorm or with a kitten. Now I want to talk about a challenge that existed between Lewis and Tolkien. A challenge which had a big impact. Lewis's more pronounced emphasis upon imaginative writing in the late 1940s and 1950s had also developed into a much earlier impetus right back to the mid-1930s. This was a challenge that Lewis and Tolkien had set themselves long before the Narnian stories began. They agreed sometime in 1936 that the world needed more of the kind of books they liked to read, and that they should each write a story, one on space and the other on time travel. That key moment of challenge relates to a crisis period in the life of Lewis and also in that of Tolkien. Both had at that time published little scholarship for a substantial period, though Lewis's The Allegory of Love, 1936, many years in preparation, was about to appear, as was Tolkien's milestone essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, published 1937. According to the leading Tolkien scholar, according to Tom Shippey, both must have felt anxious and underpublished, with only each other to keep them writing. Both of these frustrated writers felt that their ambitions to be significant poets had been thwarted, even though both, as Shippey remarks, had devoted immense time and energy to writing poetry. For Lewis, the challenge also marked a turn from writing narrative poetry to prose fiction. In fact, much of the prose he wrote from them on would become increasingly poetic, or at least elusive. So much so that Lewis's friend, the poet Ruth Piper that I mentioned earlier, turned some of the text of his story Perelandra into poetry. There is something amusing about two Oxford scholars, both engaged in pioneering academic exploration of language and literature, deciding to write fiction for an audience far wider than their peers. Lewis was well aware, however, that such writing would be regarded as lowbrow. It was an important step for Lewis in developing skills in proper communication. His book of space travel, Out of the Silent Planet, 1938, can be said to be an ancestor of the books that married, quote, theological reflection and poetic imagination, unquote, like Perelandra, 1943, and The Great Divorce, 1946, Chronicles of Narnia, Until We Have Faces. Now, a little about the new path and Narnia. I could speak a lot about Narnia, but it'll have to be another time. Lewis was doing many things in creating the Chronicles of Narnia. What is clear from his life, from what he said about Narnia, is that he was telling a story for the love of it, creating a secondary world inspired by his friend Tolkien's subcreation of Middle-earth, and embodying in it virtues and values he himself found to be desirable and indeed essential for our very humanity, whether child or adult. This creation was directed against a modern trend that Lewis saw as no less than a move towards the abolition of the human being. He set forth a powerful philosophical case for the existence of this danger in his philosophical book, The Abolition of Man that I mentioned before. Lewis also presented the danger of the trend in his science fiction, That Hid His Strength, 1945, which largely was positively reviewed by George Orwell, in which he alluded, this is George Orwell, in which he alluded to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which had taken place just days before Orwell wrote his review. But Lewis was also doing something that he, along with close friends like Tolkien and authors he loved like George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton, had discovered about the nature of stories, something that he had alluded to in his letter to Carl Henry. Stories are subversive. They tiptoe past, in his words, the watchful dragons that would keep us in the dark and staleness of prison. They can change us to the core, undeceiving us. In brackets, undeception is one of the central themes in Lewis, in brackets, and moulding our perceptions and our very consciousness. In telling of Narnia, Lewis is concerned in a way to present his vision as fact, not only theory. He clearly felt that the concreteness of a tale could be more effective in persuading people than a carefully argued book, even like the book Miracles. Though a fiction of wonder, he felt that the Narnian sequence is full of resonances and connections with the world of reality in a manner both more subtle and more immediate than that of the literalness of allegory. The lion's roar made the earth shake, and his song had brought the world into being, the world of Narnia, of course. I didn't want to confuse you. Now, a little bit about capturing the real and tasting the other. Though there is a great consistency in Lewis's views of imagination and myth over many years, they were deepened and I think transformed by his acceptance of the Christian doctrine of incarnation. He was led to this acceptance through coming to see the connection between imagination and myth on the one hand, and the incarnation of the divine and the human Christ in real history. On the other, in the incarnation, as Lewis was to put it, quote, myth became fact, end quote, a concept he took from Tolkien. His friend played a major part during 1931 in convincing Lewis of the connection when he turned back to Christianity about halfway through his life. Lewis's memoir of his early life, from nursery days in the north of Ireland to his Christian conversion in 1931, Surprised by Joy, is told in a way that parallels his allegory, The Pilgrim's Regress. If you can find a copy of it, I think you would love it as a book. I remember writing to publishers saying, I want a copy of the book and I can't get it anywhere. It was republished in the end. Both have their heart the quality that Lewis called joy, an inconsolable longing or desire that nothing on earth can fulfill. Lewis's quest, which finally led to a reluctant conversion to theism and then to Christian belief, found him discovering that this, quote, joy, unquote, was in fact the telltale footprint of the supreme object of human desire. The other for Lewis turned out to be a person behind the universe, not blind matter, a realization that led to that return, with the help of friends like Tolkien and Owen Barfield, to Christian belief, and to what Dorothy L. Sayers would call the drama of his doctrine, the drama of his dogma or doctrine. The development of Lewis's thinking about imagination was part of his quest to grasp or capture the real and to achieve a surrender, though reluctant, of the self to the other. This surrender in various forms is often captured as almost a signature theme of Undeception in his fiction and in his memoir. His quest for the real explains the course of Lewis's imaginative writing, from the early allegory, The Pilgrim's Regress, through his science fiction, his theological fictions such as The Screwtape Letters and the Narnian Chronicles, to his retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche that I mentioned earlier, and in his novel Till We Have Faces. It also explains his deliberate change in strategy in the 1950s. His move in emphasis from abstract or heavily reasoned Christian apologetics to a more concrete and poetic style of communication that he had already developed primarily in his imaginative writings, but which were also present in his discursive writings like Miracles and his essay called Transposition, which I think is one of Lewis's greatest essays. Lewis was an able philosopher, and his quest for the real was part of the perennial discussion carried on throughout the history of philosophy concerning the relationship between the universal and the particular, the abstract and the concrete, the general and the instance. Like Tolkien, his friend and colleague in the Oxford English School, Lewis explored this quandary in language and literature. As a philosopher, he explored it in human thought. His thinking, as was Tolkien's, was deeply influenced by that of another close friend, Owen Barfield, embodied, for instance, in Barfield's groundbreaking book called Poetic Diction, which is still available. What I've written in the last few paragraphs is, of course, an example of abstract and general reasoning. Lewis can provide somewhat more particular, but still necessarily rather general, insights into the nature of his quest. In a letter written in 1949, he confessed, quote, "Poetry I take to be the continual effort to bring language back to the actual," close quote. Another significant statement is found in the second book in his science fiction trilogy, set in the planet Venus. Here, the central character is a Cambridge philologist called Elwyn Ransom, loosely based upon Tolkien. Upon Ransom's return to Earth, Lewis, as a character in the fiction, relates, quote, I had incautiously said to Ransom, of course I realise it's all rather too vague for you to put into words. End of quote. Then he took me up rather sharply for such a patient man by saying, quote, on the contrary, it is words that are vague. The reason why the thing can't be expressed is that it is too definite for language. The quest for the concrete, definite thing, or the real as opposed to the abstraction, is one of the central themes of Lewis's life and writings. As we know from the Narnia stories, Lewis was capable of expressing profound ideas in a way that a child can grasp. In 1956, Lewis wrote memorably of the importance and elusiveness of the definite thing to a child. The child was somebody called Joan Lancaster. When encouraging her writing skills, she had written to Lewis, and this is part of his answer. And it's something which I've told not just to children, but to adults as well, about writing skills. And this is what Lewis says, based on the letter that he'd received from his child Joan. You describe your wonderful night, that's N-I-G-H-T, night, very well. That is, you describe the place and the people and the night and the feeling of it all very well, but not the thing itself, the setting, but not the jewel. And no wonder. Wordsworth often does the same. His prelude, you're bound to read it in about 10 years hence. Don't try it now, or you'll only spoil it for later reading. Is full of moments in which everything except the thing itself is described. If you become a writer, you'll be trying to describe the thing all your life. And lucky if, out of dozens of books, 1 or 2 sentences, just for a moment, come near to getting it across. Not only did Lewis find the thing elusive to capture in writing, but also when one attempts to capture or formulate it in theoretical terms. And here's what Lewis says. Human intellect is incurably abstract. Pure mathematics is the type of successful thought. Yet the only realities we experience are concrete. This pain, this pleasure, this dog, this man. While we are loving the man, bearing the pain, enjoying the pleasure, we are not intellectually approaching pleasure, pain, or personality. When we begin to do so, on the other hand, the concrete realities sink to the level of mere instances or examples. We are no longer dealing with them, but with that which they exemplify. This is our dilemma, either to taste and not to know, or to know and not to taste. Or more strictly, to lack one kind of knowledge because we are in an experience, or to lack another kind because we are outside it. And here Lewis quotes, if only my toothache would stop, I could write another chapter without pain, unquote. But once it stops, what do I know about pain? Lewis is pointing out that there is more than one kind of truthful knowledge, and that the process of theoretical thought, by necessity, excludes knowledge by experience, that is, existential knowledge. As he struggled with this dilemma over many years, Lewis found the key to its solution in a necessary contrast between reason and imagination. In experimental or operative knowledge, he came to believe the imagination plays as important a role as the intellect does in theoretical knowledge. In the literary arts, Lewis found the imagination most profoundly at work in the creation of myth. And here's another quotation from Lewis. Of this tragic dilemma, the divorce of the abstract from the tangible, Myth is the partial solution. In the enjoyment of a great myth, we come nearest to experience as a concrete what can afterwards be understood only as an abstraction. At this moment, for example, I'm trying to understand something very abstract indeed, the fading, vanishing of tasted reality as we try to grasp it with the discursive reason. Probably I have made heavy weather of it, but if I remind you instead of Orpheus and Eurydice, how he was suffered to lead her by the hand, but when he turned round to look at her, she disappeared. What was merely a principle becomes imaginable. The work of the imagination, Lewis implies, is larger than its role in the visual or literary or other arts, or in the sciences, and it is the imagination, more than any other of our mental faculties, that is most successful in perceiving and capturing the thing. This is because the imagination, in his words, is the organ of meaning, not of truth. The thing captured by the imagination is the object of thought, like any real thing, rather than an abstract truth. It belongs to the world of experience, sensation, and contingency, and yet embodies general qualities of meaning by the very nature of imaginative perception, just as a theoretical truth quite probably embodies a methodological reduction by the nature of abstract reasoning, which, if turned into an idol, falls into the snare of reductionism. Lewis, it is clear, thought it folly to confuse theoretical truth with a real thing. As he argued, quoting Lewis, truth is always about something, but reality is about which truth is. I'll say that, his sentence again. Truth is always about something, but reality is about which truth is. The role of the imagination in truth-seeking and knowledge gaining was much discussed by Lewis and his close friends, such as Barfield and Tolkien. There were many differences as well as affinities between them as they explored together, a theme whose pedigree belongs to the Romantic movement in poets and thinkers such as Wordsworth and Coleridge, who were themselves reacting against what is called the Enlightenment project and the positivists' claim that the natural sciences and rationalism are the only models for truth and knowledge, and that values are messy distractions in capturing fact. For Lewis and friends, the imagination allowed the perception of values and meaning in tangible and not just abstract form. Imagination worked as thought in capturing the real. There are numerous examples of Lewis's concern with qualities and abstractions and their capture in imaginative literature in his writings through the years. In an essay on Shakespeare's Hamlet, he isolated the state of being dead as an overriding quality embodied in the play. He remarked, and Lewis is quoting, "It is this which gives to the whole world its quality of darkness and of misgiving. The world of Hamlet is a world where one has lost one's way." Actually, that's what Lewis was saying, sorry. In another paper on St. Walter Scott, he spoke of, quote, sweetness and light of Scott's mind, and remarked that it was he who taught us feeling for a period. In an essay on William Morris, he discussed a balance and yet tension between two moods in his writings: a positive and violent passion for immortality and a feeling that the world of mortality is more than enough for our allegiance. Finally, one of many more examples could be cited. I give a favorite of my own. Lewis singled out what he called undeception, the process of becoming undeceived, as a pivot or watershed of 4 of Jane Austen's novels. And Lewis is quoted here. In Northampton Abbey and Emma, it precipitates the happy ending. In Sense and Sensibility, it renders it possible. In Pride and Prejudice, it initiates a re-evaluation of Darcy, both in Elizabeth's mind and in our minds, which is completed by the visit to Pemberley. After reading Lewis's account of Unconception in Jane Austen's fiction, my eyes were opened to the fluency of this theme in Lewis's own fiction. One day, I felt the need to read up again on C.S. Lewis on deception. What was it about? I looked through various collections of essays for the one on Unconception, but failed to find it. Then I remembered that he had brought it up in his essay on Jane Austen. When I found the passage, I was shocked to find how short the comment was, considering how central the quality was in his fictional work. Now, something here on what Lewis thought of transposition, participation, and metamorphosis or change. In exploring how myth and imagination make possible an integration of the abstract and concrete, Lewis turned in his sermon essay, Transposition, to the principle of hierarchy, which he believed exists in both nature and supernature. In knowledge gaining, the principle of hierarchy is the movement from concrete to more abstract, from lower to higher. For instance, we indwell our bodies in perceiving higher levels of meaning and thus becoming more and more in contact with reality. In thought and in the formation of truth claims, the material causal conditions, such as those of our brains, are transcended. In thinking, we actively participate with meanings and thus have contact with realities on a higher level. The focus is on something real beyond the material. We think intentionally of something beyond our thought processes. I think I'll skip a bit there, or else we might dull our brains a bit, maybe. No, maybe it's clear. But Lewis writes beautifully about it in that essay. If you get a chance to read it, it's one of his most important essays, I think. And he's talking philosophy, but not using lots of philosophical terms. Owen Barfield believed that Lewis's essay, Transposition, was a rare disclosure by him, quote, the movement of his mind on the subject of imagination. He slowly came to realize that, in his, Barfield's view, the essay amounts to a theory of imagination in which imagination is not mentioned. He adds, quote, read it carefully and you will find all proper ingredients: metamorphosis, interpenetration of meanings, interpenetration of mind and body, of spirit and soul. Lewis, in Transposition, in effect, is theologically filling out and vindicating how the work of the imagination connects with the historical moment of the incarnation of Christ and the linked events of his death and resurrection, when supremely myth became fact and the elusive capturing of the general and the abstract in the tangible happened in the first century history. Similarly, that is why Tolkien, referring to the New Testament gospel narratives, commented in his important essay on fairy story, art has been verified. I love that expression from Tolkien. As Coleridge, George MacDonald and Dorothy L. Sayers all believed the human imagination and its creativity reveals the presence of the image of God in human beings. For them, we have eternity within our hearts. It follows from Lewis's view of transposition, as set out in his sermon essay, that through the matrix of our own physical bodies, and while dependent upon our sensations and the firing of our brain neurons, we're able to look into and actually participate in a world immensely larger than our senses. As in all growth in knowledge, from the lower we grasp the higher by surrendering to it. Surrender of the self is, for Lewis, central to gaining oneself. I cannot resist concluding with a fascinating and perhaps surprising example of such surrender and gain what Lewis offered from his own experience. It comes from one of his last books published before he died, in the period when imaginative man had become more central in his awareness. Its profundity struck me the first time I read it, and I've never forgotten it, but it also made me chuckle a little over his open bookishness. I'm allowed to say Lewis was bookish from very young. The unexpected dimensions of reading. Lewis was completely conscious of this bookishness. His love, particularly of old books, inspired his literary scholarship on the literature of the 16th century, the medieval allegory of love, and in particular, the poetry of Spenser and of Milton. It was the secret of the continued readability and freshness of his literary studies, many decades after they were written. How do reading and the experience of other arts relate to escaping from self-centeredness and grasping what is objective to us? Lewis's answer shows an integration between his scholarship and his fiction, even his Narnia stories for children. He writes, quote, "In love, in virtue, in the pursuit of knowledge, and in the reception of the arts," unquote, we go, quote, "out of the self to correct its provincialism and heal its loneliness." Obviously, this process can be described either as an enlargement or as a temporary annihilation of the self. But that is the old paradox. Quote, "He that loseth his life shall save it." An experiment, Lewis's book, An Experiment in Criticism, the book which contains this statement, is a deceptively simple guide to reading, which in fact distills a lifetime scholarship and reading, both high and lowbrow. To quote a memorable passage from the book Experiment in Criticism. "The man who is contented to be only himself, and therefore less of a self, is in prison. My eyes are not enough for me. I will see through those of others. Reality, even seen through the eyes of many, is not enough. I will see what others have invented. Even the eyes of all humanity are not enough. I regret that the brutes cannot write books. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with a myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do." Now, almost finished. Here Lewis speaks of a parallel between reading and love. And a couple of pages before, he has mentioned how in, quote, "love we escape from ourselves into one other," unquote. He explored this in his book, The Four Loves, one of the four being that of friendship, which he deeply valued throughout his life, and which is one of the secrets behind his popularity with many throughout the world, East and West. Though The Four Loves might not be considered one of Lewis's best books, it is an example of one written later in life with a greater awareness of his desire for the imaginative man, not to be hindered in his creation. Another of his books, thoroughly driven by the urge to write the kind of book he liked, powerfully shows the power of the imaginative man. From his early life, Lewis liked the retelling of myth and encouraging friends like Barfield and Tolkien to do so. In 1956, he published the retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche, which belongs with his volumes of Christian apologetics that are in imaginative form. Remarkably, it is unlike his notable retellings of a Christian mythos, like his science fiction trilogy, The Great Divorce and the Chronicles of Narnia, in that it is set in a pre-Christian world in the time of ancient Greece and what he called paganism. His friend Tolkien also largely sets his legendarium, of which The Lord of the Rings is a part, in a pre-Christian setting. Both were accomplishing their view of the pagan imagination being capable of having an unfocused but real capture of fact in myth. Both were exploring anticipations of the Christian story in ancient myth. In a letter to Professor Clyde S. Kilby, an American scholar, Lewis explained what he intended Psyche to be, an example of the anima naturaliter Christiana, quote, a soul naturally Christian, unquote. Thanks. I thought I might have another page there.
Thank you so much, Colin. That was so rich. I've got a suggestion, partly because of the timing with those at home. And if any of us have any burning questions from this afternoon, from the first session, I wonder if we hold them and maybe at the end of the second session, we sort of put all the questions together. So we have a little bit of a break now. Does that feel good? Okay, let's do that. And if we're able, we will regroup at 2:30. I think that's when we're due back, at 2:30 for Lewis, The Way of Friendship. See us all back before too long.